Hi everyone, welcome to my presentation of the Civil Rights in America. My name is Ansley Johnson and this is for my Social Foundations class. Okay, so what is civil rights? Civil rights are the basic rights that each person has under the laws of the government. The word civil rights actually comes from the Latin word ius civis, which means rights of a citizen. And lastly, the civil rights of each person are protected under the U.S. Constitution. So, who can gain access to civil rights? Absolutely everyone. Anyone that is a U.S. citizen should and do have civil rights under the United States Constitution. So the fight for civil rights means that regardless of what gender you are, where you are from, what race, religion, nationality, or disability, you should have the same rights as anyone else. So who fought for civil rights in America? I'm glad you asked. So the first movement that we're going to talk about is the Native American Civil Rights Movement, then the Slavery and Abolition, the African American Civil Rights Movement, and women's suffrage movement, and then today. Okay, so our first civil rights movement was the Native American Civil Rights Movement. Let's see. It mainly occurred in the 1960s and the 1970s. The three main rights fought for was justice, freedom, and respect. Now, the Native American rights movement had a dual goal. They wanted to achieve the civil rights of Native American peoples as American citizens and the sovereign rights of Native American nations. Additionally, the Native Americans, they fought to keep their tribes separate and distinct from other Americans. So basically, they wanted their civil rights, but also they wanted to keep their culture and their traditional values that they grew up with. And just like the next movement that we're about to talk about, they also fought against dispossession, racism, poverty, and violence. With the emergence of the African Native Americans, this movement joined forces with the African American Civil Rights Movement. And if you look to your right, you can see a picture of some of our Native American tribal members, and then also there's Muhammad Ali and a couple of other celebrities. Okay, so slavery and abolition. Slavery was a long-running theme throughout American history, dating back to the settlement of North America. The 13th Amendment was enacted in 1865 on December the 18th to abolish slavery. Thinking this was a feat for the slave community, many prominent white Southerners, they weren't too keen on this idea. They didn't like the fact that their slaves could now roam freely. So this soon evolved into the creation of what's called the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK. And this was one of the many white supremacist organizations that were created in 1877. Now, back in those times, you have to understand there were some nice slave owners, but the majority of the slaves were owned by not so nice people, and they were treated really poorly. So oftentimes, the slaves, they would be blamed for things that they didn't even do and treated more like property than a human. So let's talk about the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. If you look to your left, that's a picture of them and their little outfits that they wore. Looks kind of crazy, doesn't it? To me, it looks like they're wearing a bunch of bed sheets. But the KKK was founded in 1865, and by 1870, there were many clans throughout all of the southern states. The creation of this organization actually occurred around the same time President Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction Plan for after the Civil War. It was an underground organization composed of mainly white supremacists, which were very rich white property owners. They called their leader the Grand Wizard. And the first leader of the KKK was a man by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And the people of the nation thought that the KKK was awful. But then, with the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted the basic civil rights to all of the people of color, by 1920, there were over 4 million people involved in the KKK. Now, I want you to understand, guys, that the KKK was not a good organization to be a part of. They would pick out people of color who really, they were nice people, and they would terrorize these poor colored people and just destroy their homes. They would take their property from them and basically just demean them in every way possible. And even some of them, they threatened their lives. Which brings us to our next civil rights movement, the African American Civil Rights Movement. So this movement really came to power in light in the 1950s and the 60s. And there were many peaceful protests to ensure the safety of the African American rights as citizens, and they were fighting against segregation. This movement really made the American people confront the past and all of those terrible things they'd done to the slaves and how the African Americans had been treated. So this was what banded all of them together, and they really, decided, hey, we are not property. We are human beings, and we deserve the same rights as people who aren't the same color as we are. Which brings us to the Jim Crow laws. This stated that all colored people were to be separate but equal from white people. That meant separate bathrooms, separate waiting rooms, separate places to eat in the restaurant, and separate water fountains. So, additionally, when these laws were enacted, African Americans did not have the right to vote. The Jim Crow system was upheld by local government officials and enforced by acts of terror perpetrated by vigilance. And in 1896, the Supreme Court established the doctrine of separate but equal in the Plessy versus Ferguson case after a black man in New Orleans attempted to sit in a whites-only railway car. One of the main influential activists against the Jim Crow laws was Miss Ida B. Wells. She was seated in the first-class white section of the railway car and was forcibly removed after she refused to leave. She was the author of the Free Speech and Headlight newspaper, and she investigated some of the known lynching and other crimes made against black people. And those crimes that they're talking about, those are also some of the crimes that the KKK committed. Do you remember what we talked about earlier? The Jim Crow laws were finally overshadowed and basically abolished with the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So if you look to your right, you'll see a picture of an African American man, and he's standing under a sign. And can y'all tell me what that says? It says colored waiting room. So you remember how we talked about that they would have separate waiting rooms? So white people and colored people couldn't sit in the same waiting room. So if they were in the doctor's office, white people would sit on one side of the room and then colored people would sit on the other side of the room, which I think was very unfair, don't you? And even with Miss Ida B. Wells, she just sat in a seat, but it happened that that seat was in the white section and not in the colored section. I can remember my mom telling me that when she was a little girl and they would go to the doctor's office. They still had the sign in there that had over the water fountains that said colored water fountain and then white's water fountain. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Montgomery bus boycott. So this event, it lasted from December the 5th to 1955 to December 20th of 1956. Rosa Parks was arrested because she refused to give up her seat on December the 1st of 1955. Kind of sounds like Miss Ida B. Wells, doesn't it? The Montgomery Improvement Association was created in response. The leader of this organization was the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King declared the real meaning of the Montgomery bus boycott to be the power of a growing self-respect to animate the struggle for civil rights. And they really believed in peaceful protest, which brings us to our last point on this slide. It says the peaceful protest of this organization set the course for other protests that were to come. And if you look to your left, this is a little illustrated book that tells the story of Rosa Parks when she sat in a white person's seat. Okay, now we're going to talk about Martin Luther King Jr. He was one of the greatest influential activists during the Civil Rights Movement, and so he was a Baptist preacher, and he saw equality and human rights for African Americans, the economically disadvantaged, and all of the victims of injustice through peaceful protest. As mentioned before, he was involved in the Montgomery bus boycott and on the March on Washington in 1963. His most popular speech actually came from that March on Washington, and it was the I Have a Dream speech. It was very encouraging and uplifting, and he believed that the problems that they faced, that they were protesting, could be solved by love. And King was assassinated on April the 4th of 1968 on a balcony of a motel in Memphis. And now we get to celebrate Martin Luther King Day every year, and the next year coming up, it will be January the 17th. And this is a picture of Dr. Martin Luther King, and there's also a quote, and it says, "Man must evolve from all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love." Okay, the women's suffrage movement. Women have been seeking equal rights to be respected as men are and were. The first lady for women's rights was Miss Abigail Adams. So when the Declaration of Independence was established, it had a statement that says all men are created equal. Now Abigail, she was married to John Adams, so he was one of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence. So she wrote a letter to her husband and it asked that the members of the government also remember the women. And her husband responded with the statement, "We know better than to repeal our masculine systems." See, back in those times, men believed that women belonged in the household. They thought that women would have a more influential and powerful influence over raising a family, maintaining a household. You know, the old saying of women belong in the kitchen. So the National Women's Suffrage Association was created in 1869 by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the first president of this association. These strong ladies fought not only for equal rights, but also the right to vote on the basis that they were different from men. Utah and Idaho granted this right in 1910. However, other states, they weren't so kind. At this time, Carrie Chapman Catt, she was the president, at this point, and she devised what she called the winning plan. Now, this plan involved a blitz campaign that immobilized states and local suffrage organizations all over the country, with special focus on those resistant states and regions. So, the National Women's Party, which is next after the Women's Suffrage Association, it was a splinter group, and it was founded by Alice Paul. Now, this group, it was a little bit more aggressive than the last group we talked about. They implemented tactics such as hunger strikes and picket protests at the White House. Then along came World War I, and this obviously slowed down the women's efforts, but with women now taking on jobs that were normally held by men, they proved that they were very capable individuals and just as deserving of citizenship as the men. So finally, the 19th Amendment of the Constitution was passed on August the 18th of 1920, giving the American women the right to vote. And this is a picture of the women of that time. They're voting for the first time in America. Now, I want you to understand that all of this didn't happen so smoothly as it seems. There were a lot of women that were involved in these organizations that were arrested, that had court cases filed against them. They were treated very poorly during this time. And it was a really great feat when the 19th Amendment came along and women were allowed to vote. They were finally allowed to have a voice and a say-so. Which brings us to today. This past year has been super, super rough for us. We fight for civil rights today with organizations today through organizations known as the Black Lives Matter. In recent events throughout 2020, the main occurrence that sparked a domino effect was a man named George Floyd. And then we had other cases like Breonna Taylor. With George Floyd, if y'all will remember, he was a African American man, and the police officer knelt on his neck until he couldn't breathe, and it created this. And George Floyd passed away, but he had a statement that the Black Lives Matter uses now, and it's I can't breathe. And then with Breonna Taylor, she was wrongfully shot, and it was just a terrible situation. So the Black Lives Matter has been said to be the largest civil rights movement since Martin Luther King's time. So we have really stepped up our game since Dr. Martin Luther King. I will say that with the protests that are done by the Black Lives Matter, it is peaceful. Now there are protests that also happened that weren't so peaceful. There was looters and rioters, and these were people that they damaged the buildings of the city that they were in. They stole things that they shouldn't have, and they just claimed that it was for the civil rights movement. And they were in the wrong because, truly, those that truly believed in the Black Lives Matter movement, they weren't there to harm buildings, steal things. They were there to make a statement and say, hey, we are people. We deserve to be treated like people. So, here are my works cited. We have 3 of those. And I hope you all enjoyed my presentation. I hope you learned something about civil rights. And thank you so much for listening.